Close your eyes and imagine stepping outside your front door, but instead of the familiar world you know, you're greeted by something that would make your worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. The air carries sounds that shouldn't exist, trumpeting that shakes your bones, roars that echo off distant mountains, footsteps so heavy they register as earthquakes on your phone's seismic app. Welcome to Earth 300,000 years ago, a planet so alien, so impossibly wild, that if you somehow time-traveled there, you wouldn't just be a visitor, you'd be an appetizer. Tonight, we're diving into a world that Hollywood couldn't dream up if it tried. A world where 7 different types of humans shared watering holes with creatures that would dwarf modern elephants, where saber-toothed predators the size of small cars stalked through forests that stretched beyond horizons, where intelligence wasn't guaranteed survival, and being human meant absolutely nothing to the things that wanted to eat you. But here's the twist that should keep you awake tonight. One of those 7 human species was us, Homo sapiens, and we were pathetic, scrawny, weak, the least likely to make it out alive. Yet somehow, impossibly, we're the only ones left to tell this story. What happened to everyone else? What happened to the giants? And how did the weakest link in the human chain become the apex predator of an entire planet? The answer is written in blood, bone, and a survival story so brutal, so cunning, that it makes Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story. Let me paint you a picture that will change how you see every step you take on this planet. Picture Morocco, but not the Morocco of today, with its bustling cities and tourist beaches. Picture it 300,000 years ago, when the Sahara was green and rivers carved pathways through landscapes that no modern human has ever seen. At a watering hole that sparkled under stars whose light took different paths through an atmosphere we wouldn't recognize, something unprecedented was happening. 7 different kinds of humans were gathering for what might have been the most significant moment in our planet's history, and they had no idea they were making history. They were just thirsty. The Neanderthals arrived first, moving with the confidence of apex predators who'd owned Europe for 200,000 years. Imagine linebacker builds wrapped in pale skin, with skulls so thick you could use them as battering rams. Their brains were actually larger than ours, packed with 1,650 cubic centimeters of cold-adapted intelligence. These weren't the knuckle-draggers of old textbooks. These were the Romans of the Ice Age, and they knew it. From the eastern shadows came figures that moved wrong. Too tall, too lean, with adaptations that wouldn't make sense for another 299,000 years. The Denisovans had walked here from mountains so high that breathing there would kill most modern humans. Their genes carried secrets that would one day allow Tibetan people to live where others suffocate. But tonight, they just wanted water and a place to rest their impossibly long legs. Then came the originals, Homo erectus families approaching from the south, and even the mighty Neanderthals stepped back with something resembling respect. These were the ancestors who'd been walking upright for 1.7 million years, while everyone else was still theoretical. Their technology might have been outdated, their brains smaller, but they'd survived ice ages that had erased entire continents' worth of life. Experience commanded attention. But here's where it gets weird. Really weird. Shuffling from the forest came something that shouldn't have existed according to every evolutionary theory we had until recently. Homo naledi, with brains no bigger than chimpanzees, but hands that crafted tools with disturbing precision. They were living contradictions, proof that our understanding of intelligence and survival was embarrassingly wrong. The Northern Darkness released another impossibility. Homo heidelbergensis, the grandfather species that had given birth to both Neanderthals and eventually us. Looking at them was like staring at evolution's rough draft, the prototype from which all later humans would be refined or specialized. From distant islands came the most unlikely survivors of all, Homo floresiensis, standing barely 3.5 feet tall, but carrying themselves with the confidence of giants. On their remote island home, they'd hunted miniature elephants with miniature spears, proving that size meant nothing when you had the right combination of intelligence and determination. And finally, trembling and uncertain, came us. Homo sapiens, fresh from our African birthplace, with our weird flat faces and bubble-shaped skulls that looked like evolutionary mistakes. We had no bulging muscles like the Neanderthals, no ancient wisdom like Erectus, no specialized adaptations for anything. We were the species equivalent of participation trophies, present but not particularly impressive. But we had something invisible, something that would kill every other human species at that watering hole. We had ideas that spread like viruses. We had language that could paint pictures in other minds. We had the terrifying ability to believe in things that didn't exist yet. Gods, spirits, tomorrow's hunt, next season's migration. We could convince others to die for concepts that lived only in our imagination. We were the weakest in body, but we were contagious in thought. While the others drank carefully, scanning for the very real predators that owned the night, we did something that should have gotten us killed. We looked at the stars. We drew patterns in the mud with our fingers. We were already planning tomorrow while barely surviving tonight. In the shadows beyond the firelight, something watched with professional interest. The short-faced bear stood 11 feet tall when it reared up, weighing close to 3,000 pounds of muscle and prehistoric rage. It was North America's undisputed nightmare, but even it had migrated to this ancient crossroads where different worlds collided. To this massive predator, humans were just different flavors of the same meal. But if it had been capable of prediction, it might have noticed something that would have changed its hunting strategy forever. Only one of those human species spent time staring at the sky while drinking. Only one drew abstract patterns in the dirt. Only one was already mentally living in a future that didn't exist yet. The bear didn't know it was watching the birth of something that would eventually redesign the entire planet. It just knew that those particular apes seemed distracted, which usually made for easier hunting. By dawn, all 7 species would scatter back to their respective territories. In geological terms, it would be the blink of an eye before 6 of them vanished forever. But that night, for one perfect moment, humanity was a rainbow of possibilities, gathered under stars that would never witness such diversity again. The water reflected their faces, each representing millions of years of different evolutionary experiments, each carrying unique solutions to the problem of being human in a world designed to kill you. They couldn't know they were attending their own funeral. They couldn't know that the scrawny, weird-looking species nervously sipping water at the edge would inherit everything. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. It wasn't strength that won. It wasn't intelligence in the way we typically measure it. It wasn't even luck. It was something far more disturbing. Something that should make every modern human pause and wonder what we're truly capable of. The watering hole went quiet, except for the sound of careful drinking. 7 human species sharing the same space, the same water, the same moment. The mathematical probability of this scene was so impossibly small that astronomers would call it a miracle. Yet, here they were. Here we were. And in the morning, the real story would begin. The story of how the weakest became the strongest. How the least likely survivors became the planet's ultimate predators. How we went from trembling at watering holes to emptying entire continents of life. The age of giants was ending. The age of humans was about to begin. But first, we had to survive the night. And in a world where everything was bigger, stronger, and more experienced at killing than we were, survival meant learning to think differently than anything that had ever lived. The stars above had witnessed the rise and fall of countless species. They'd watched ice ages come and go, continents drift, and life forms appear and vanish like brief candles in cosmic darkness. But they'd never seen anything like what was about to unfold. The giants that ruled this ancient world weren't just bigger versions of animals we know today. They were evolutionary masterpieces, each one a testament to what happens when nature has millions of years to perfect the art of being terrifyingly effective. Take the short-faced bear that watched our ancestors from the shadows. This wasn't your average forest dweller. Standing on its hind legs, it reached heights that would scrape modern basketball hoops. Its legs were longer than any bear alive today, built not just for power, but for speed that would shame a racehorse. When this monster decided to hunt, it could sustain 40 miles per hour across open terrain. There was no outrunning something that evolution had designed as the perfect pursuit predator. But speed was just one weapon in its arsenal. The skull alone was an engineering marvel, built for crushing bones that would shatter modern tools. This bear didn't just hunt for food, it hunted for territory, and its territory was everything it could see, smell, or imagine reaching. When it walked, the ground transmitted vibrations that other animals felt in their bones, a warning system that said quite simply, move or die. The fossil evidence tells us stories that would keep paleontologists awake at night. We find trackways in ancient mudflats where these bears followed human ancestors for miles, matching their pace exactly, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Patient stalkers that understood pursuit better than any predator alive today. And they were intelligent, frighteningly so. Cave systems across what would become North America preserve evidence of their problem-solving abilities. They didn't just hunt randomly. They remembered individual animals, tracked migration patterns, and set up ambush sites along known routes. Some caves show claw marks 15 feet up the walls, territorial scratches that required 600 pounds of muscle to carve into solid limestone. These weren't just marks. They were signatures, calling cards that announced ownership of domains larger than modern countries. But the bears were just one piece of a predatory puzzle that would challenge every survival instinct our ancestors possessed. In the forests that stretch beyond horizons, cave lions prowled with the silent efficiency of death itself. These weren't the manned kings of African savannas. These were specialized killing machines, 25% larger than any lion alive today, with bodies designed for one purpose: hunting things exactly the size of humans. The skeletal evidence is explicit: bite marks on human bones, puncture wounds that match cave lion dentition perfectly. But here's what made them truly terrifying. They were persistence hunters. While African lions rely on explosive speed for quick kills, cave lions had evolved a different strategy. They followed prey for hours, days even, waiting for the perfect moment when exhaustion made resistance impossible. Imagine being tracked by something that never tired, never gave up, never lost your scent. Something that could follow you for a week, staying just out of sight, letting you think you'd escaped, then appearing again at the moment you finally allowed yourself to rest. That was cave lion psychology. Patience weaponized into an art form. The archaeological record shows us their territories, marked not with urine, but with artwork. Cave paintings from 30,000 years ago depict these predators with disturbing accuracy. No manes longer legs than African cousins, and eyes that artists painted with pupils dilated for night hunting. These weren't observations made during safe daylight hours. These were portraits drawn by people who'd encountered these predators in darkness and somehow lived to record the experience. But even cave lions weren't the apex of predatory evolution in this ancient world. That distinction belonged to creatures that redefined what it meant to be perfectly adapted for killing. Saber-toothed cats that didn't just hunt, they performed surgical executions with 7-inch canines that could puncture windpipes and carotid arteries simultaneously. Death delivered in under 30 seconds. No struggle, no chance for escape. The mechanics were horrifyingly elegant. Their jaws could open to 120 degrees, almost straight up and down, positioning those delicate sabers with surgical precision. Modern lions manage 65 degrees, the difference between a bite and a scalpel. But here's what made them truly formidable. They hunted in coordinated groups with healthcare systems that would impress modern societies. Fossil sites reveal multiple cats with healed injuries that should have been fatal. Broken legs, shattered ribs, punctured skulls, all mended over months of care. Someone was feeding these injured predators, protecting them while they recovered. These weren't just hunting packs. They were social networks with medical support. Imagine facing not one saber-toothed predator, but an entire clan that cared for its wounded, shared resources, and coordinated attacks with military precision. That was the reality our ancestors navigated daily. And we haven't even discussed the giants that made the predators look small. Ground sloths the size of pickup trucks armed with claws like scimitars, moving through forests with surprising speed despite their massive bulk. These weren't the slow, harmless creatures their name suggests. When threatened, they could rear up on hind legs and swing those claws faster than human eyes could track. Cave paintings show the distinctive parallel gouges they left on human skulls, spacing that matches their anatomy exactly. Woolly mammoths whose intelligence rivaled that of modern elephants, but whose size dwarfed anything alive today. Matriarchs who remembered every water source across territories the size of modern states, leading herds in migrations that carved highways across continents. Their social structures were complex enough that disrupting them meant breaking communication networks that had functioned for millions of years. But the most terrifying aspect of this ancient world wasn't the individual predators or giants. It was the ecosystem they created together. Competition for resources was so intense that every meal was a battlefield. Hyenas, cave bears, dire wolves, short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats, and early humans all competing for the same carcasses. Archaeological sites preserve the evidence in layers of tooth marks, each species trying to claim what others had killed. This wasn't a world where humans sat comfortably at the top of any food chain. We were participants in a biological free-for-all, where survival meant either being the strongest, the fastest, the smartest, or the most cooperative. And since we weren't the strongest or fastest, we had to become something else entirely. We had to become something that had never existed before. The fossil record from 300,000 years ago shows human ancestors making a crucial discovery. Not fire itself, which we'd controlled for millennia, but fire as a weapon. Burn scars preserved in sediment layers show deliberate ignition patterns. Someone was setting entire ecosystems ablaze, not accidentally, but strategically. They were turning landscape itself into a hunting tool. Drive animals between flames and waiting spears. Transform savannas into killing fields. Use the environment as an extension of their weapons technology. This wasn't hunting anymore. This was ecological warfare, and it worked with devastating efficiency. But it also changed something fundamental about what it meant to be human. We weren't adapting to our environment. We were adapting our environment to us. The psychological shift was seismic. Every other species on Earth accepted the rules of their ecosystem as immutable facts. Predators hunt during certain times. Prey animals migrate along established routes. Water sources dictate population distribution. Food availability limits group size. We decided rules were suggestions. When water was scarce, we found ways to transport it. When prey was too dangerous to hunt directly, we invented projectile weapons. When territories were controlled by larger predators, we used fire to evict them. When individual strength wasn't sufficient, we developed cooperation that could overwhelm any competitor. But perhaps most importantly, we developed something that no other species possessed: the ability to imagine different outcomes and then work systematically to achieve them. While saber-toothed cats perfected their killing techniques over millions of years of evolutionary refinement, we were experimenting with new killing techniques every generation. While cave lions maintained territories through pure dominance, we were figuring out how to expand territories through strategic alliance. While ground sloths relied on size and strength that had served them for millions of years, we were inventing tools that made size irrelevant. The archaeological evidence shows this cognitive revolution accelerating at an unprecedented pace. Tool technology that remained static for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly exploding into diversity. Art appearing where none had existed. Burial practices suggesting beliefs in afterlives that required planning beyond immediate survival. We were becoming something that evolution had never produced before, a species that could consciously direct its own development. The other human species at that watering hole 300,000 years ago were following evolutionary scripts that had been written over millions of years. Neanderthals perfecting cold weather adaptations, Denisovans spreading across impossible environmental ranges, Erectus maintaining stable technologies that had worked for nearly 2 million years. We were writing new scripts entirely, scripts that said the rules of biology were optional, scripts that said intelligence could triumph over strength, scripts that said cooperation could overwhelm any individual competitor. But we were about to discover that our greatest enemy wasn't the giants that surrounded us. It was each other. The most chilling discovery in all of paleontology isn't a fossil. It's not a bone or a tool or a cave painting. It's a footprint. White Sands, New Mexico. 23,000 years ago. Preserved in what was once a lakeside mudflat, archaeologists found something that rewrote everything we thought we knew about human migration to the Americas. A teenager's footprint, perfect as if made yesterday. Except yesterday was during the last ice age when mile-high glaciers supposedly made human presence impossible. But here's what makes your blood run cold. You can see exactly where this teenager shifted the weight of the toddler they were carrying on their hip. You can see where they stopped to rest, where they put the child down and picked them up again. A moment of prehistoric parenting frozen in stone, proving that humans were living in North America thousands of years earlier than we ever imagined. And they were walking barefoot through a landscape populated by creatures that could crush them without effort. The trackway tells a story that reads like a thriller. Human footprints crossing mammoth tracks. A giant ground sloth's trail suddenly veering away when it caught human scent. These people weren't just surviving alongside the megafauna. They were navigating through them with the casual confidence of apex predators, which raises a terrifying question. How did the weakest human species become so confident so quickly? The answer lies in what happened during those crucial millennia between the watering hole gathering and these fearless footprints. Something transformed us from nervous scavengers into ecosystem engineers. Something that other human species either couldn't or wouldn't do. We learned to kill efficiently, not just animals, each other. The archaeological evidence from this period reads like a crime scene report. Human bones showing cut marks identical to those found on butchered animals. Caves with evidence of systematic cannibalism, not from desperation, but as standard practice. Tools designed specifically for processing human remains, used so frequently they show distinctive wear patterns. This wasn't random violence. This was industrialized murder. At sites across Africa and Europe, we find evidence of what can only be described as prehistoric assembly lines for death. Human skulls crafted into drinking cups, showing wear patterns from regular use. Bone tools made from human femurs, shaped with the same precision used for hunting implements. Cut marks revealing that early humans understood anatomy better than many modern medical students. Someone had developed systematic techniques for killing and processing their own species, and they were teaching these techniques to others. But the most disturbing discovery comes from analyzing the timing. These human-on-human violence patterns appear in the archaeological record at exactly the same time other human species begin disappearing from the same regions. The correlation is too precise to be coincidental. We weren't just competing with Neanderthals and Denisovans for resources. We were eliminating them as competitors, methodically, efficiently, with the same technological innovation we applied to hunting mammoths. The genetic evidence supports this horrifying conclusion. Modern human DNA contains fragments from other human species, but only in specific patterns that suggest very limited interbreeding, followed by rapid population replacement. We absorbed just enough of their genetic material to gain useful traits, then systematically eliminated the source populations. It's the biological equivalent of corporate espionage followed by hostile takeover. Neanderthal sites across Europe tell this story in heartbreaking detail. Archaeological layers showing stable occupation for thousands of years, then sudden abandonment. Not gradual decline, not slow migration, abrupt termination, as if entire populations vanished overnight. The final Neanderthal sites show signs of desperate adaptation, technology changing rapidly after remaining static for millennia. Jewelry appearing for the first time in their archaeological record. Attempts to copy Homo sapiens innovations. They were trying to become more like us, perhaps recognizing that their traditional approaches weren't working against this new threat. It didn't matter. By 40,000 years ago, they were gone from the archaeological record. The last populations retreating to Gibraltar, literally the edge of their world, where they held out for a few more millennia before disappearing forever. The Denisovans vanished even more completely. We know they existed primarily through DNA extracted from a handful of bone fragments and teeth. Their entire species reduced to genetic ghosts haunting our chromosomes. Whatever happened to them was so thorough that they left almost no physical trace. Homo erectus, the grandfather species that had survived for nearly 2 million years through ice ages and volcanic catastrophes, succumbed to something they'd never encountered before. Not climate change, not natural disaster. Competition from their own descendants who had learned to wage war as systematically as they hunted mammoth. By 50,000 years ago, the transformation was complete. 7 human species had become one. The watering hole that once reflected diverse faces now reflected only ours. But victory came with a price that we're still paying today. The psychological impact of systematic interspecies violence fundamentally altered human consciousness. For the first time in evolutionary history, a species had made itself deliberately alone. We'd eliminated not just competitors, but witnesses. Alternative ways of being human. Different solutions to the problem of intelligence and survival. The cave art from this period reflects this transformation. Earlier paintings show humans as small figures in landscapes dominated by giant animals. Post-extinction art shows humans as central figures, with animals reduced to resources or threats to be managed. The psychological relationship had inverted. We were no longer participants in nature. We were its directors. This cognitive shift enabled the final phase of our planetary conquest, the systematic elimination of megafauna that had dominated Earth for millions of years. The killing techniques we'd perfected on other humans proved devastatingly effective on giant animals. Coordinated group hunting, strategic use of fire to manipulate entire ecosystems, projectile weapons that allowed killing from safe distances. Most importantly, the psychological willingness to destroy anything that competed with us for resources. The mammoth kill sites from this period show evidence of industrial-scale slaughter. Entire herds ambushed at water sources, coordinated drives that pushed hundreds of animals off cliffs, processing stations where tons of meat were systematically butchered and preserved. But here's what makes these sites truly chilling. Archaeological analysis shows that much of the meat was never consumed. Cut marks indicate selective harvesting of only the choicest parts, with massive quantities left to rot. This wasn't subsistence hunting. This was recreational killing on a scale that would make modern poachers seem restrained. Ground sloth sites tell similar stories. These 15-foot-tall giants, armed with claws that could disembowel predators, were being systematically hunted to extinction by creatures a tenth their size. The fossil evidence shows increasingly desperate defensive behaviors. Sloths spinning in circles, slashing at threats coming from multiple directions, dying of exhaustion before their hunters even moved in for the kill. We'd learned to weaponize patience, to turn an animal's own defensive instincts against it, to kill through psychological warfare as much as physical violence. The cave bear extinctions reveal perhaps the most disturbing pattern of all. These massive predators, perfectly adapted to their environments, weren't killed in direct confrontation. We simply took their caves, moved into their territories, used fire to make their shelters uninhabitable, forced them into marginal habitats where they slowly starved. We discovered that you don't need to be stronger than your competitors. You just need to be more systematic about destroying their ability to compete. Within 10,000 years of achieving global dominance, Homo sapiens had emptied entire continents of their megafauna. Australia lost 90% of its large animals. The Americas lost 80%. Even isolated islands that had never seen large predators were systematically cleared of anything bigger than a dog. The mathematical precision is terrifying. Computer models show that human populations of just a few thousand individuals could drive species with millions of years of evolutionary success to extinction in mere centuries, targeting of reproductive cycles and habitat. Not through overwhelming numbers, but through strategic destruction. We'd become something that evolution had never produced before. Each species deserved to exist. And we were making those decisions based on a simple criterion. Does this compete a species that could consciously decide which other died? If it was no, it lived. Until with us? If the answer was yes, it. The transformation was complete. Earth, 300,000 years ago, how it became competition. Then it died to have been a planet of giants where humans were footnotes in a story written by creatures that had mastered survival over millions of years. By 50,000 years ago, it had become a human planet where everything else existed only at our discretion. But we were about to discover that absolute power over your environment comes with absolute responsibility for its consequences. And we were woefully unprepared for that responsibility. The stage was set for the next chapter of our species' story, the chapter where we would learn that winning the war against nature meant inheriting all of nature's problems, where we would discover that eliminating all competition meant taking on the roles that competitors had played in maintaining planetary systems, where we would realize that becoming Earth's only intelligent species meant becoming responsible for Earth's intelligence. The question that haunts every archaeologist studying this period is simple. Was this inevitable? Was systematic elimination of competitors and megafauna the only path to human dominance? Or did we choose the most violent solution to the problem of survival? The footprints at White Sands suggest an answer that should disturb us. Those barefoot humans walking casually among giants weren't afraid because they'd already learned something that no other species possessed. They'd learned that anything could be killed if you were systematic enough about it. They were teaching that lesson to their children, passing down not just tools and techniques, but the psychological framework that said the world existed for human convenience. 23,000 years later, we're still walking in those footprints, still teaching our children that the world is ours to manage, still surprised when managing the world turns out to be more complicated than we thought. The teenager carrying a toddler across that ancient lakeshore couldn't know they were leaving evidence of humanity's greatest transformation. They were just trying to get from one place to another safely. But their casual confidence in a world full of giants tells us everything we need to know about what we'd become and what we'd lost in becoming it. The age of giants was ending not through natural catastrophe or climate change, but through the systematic application of human intelligence to the problem of competition. We'd learned to think our way to planetary dominance. Now we had to learn to think our way through the consequences. The consequences arrived faster than anyone could have predicted. Within a few thousand years of achieving planetary dominance, something unprecedented began happening to human societies. We started turning our systematic killing expertise on ourselves with industrial efficiency that would make our megafauna hunts look like casual weekend activities. The archaeological record from this period reads like humanity's first horror novel, except every page was written in bone and blood. Sites across Europe and Asia reveal fortified settlements surrounded by mass graves. Not burial grounds where people were laid to rest with ceremony and respect. disposal sites where humans were dumped like refuse after being systematically butchered. The cut marks on these bones show the same precision our ancestors used on mammoths. The same anatomical knowledge, the same ruthless efficiency. We'd perfected the art of killing giants. Now we were applying those techniques to killing each other. But here's what makes these ancient battlefields truly chilling. The victims weren't just adult warriors dying in combat. Entire family groups were being processed with assembly line precision. Children's skulls showing the same deliberate trauma patterns as adults. Evidence of systematic elimination of bloodlines, not just individuals. Someone had decided that certain groups of humans didn't deserve to exist, and they were implementing that decision with the methodical thoroughness that had emptied continents of megafauna. The technology tells its own story. Weapons designed specifically for killing humans appear in the archaeological record with disturbing frequency. Not hunting tools adapted for warfare, but purpose-built implements for ending human lives. Specialized clubs for crushing skulls, blades shaped for slipping between ribs, projectile points weighted specifically for penetrating human torsos. We were innovating our way toward more efficient murder just as systematically as we'd innovated our way toward mammoth extinction. But perhaps most disturbing of all, we were getting better at it. Sites from later periods show evidence of technological arms races between human groups. Defensive fortifications that required massive coordinated labor to construct. Weapons that could only be manufactured by specialists with years of training. Tactics that demanded military organization, sophisticated enough to coordinate attacks across multiple settlements. We weren't just killing each other, we were professionalizing it. The genetic evidence from this period supports what the archaeological record suggests. Population bottlenecks so severe that entire regional populations vanished from the genetic record. Not through disease or climate change, but through systematic elimination by other humans, who then replaced them completely. It's the same pattern we see with Neanderthal and Denisovan extinctions, but accelerated and intensified. We'd learned to apply interspecies genocide techniques to intraspecies competition. The cave art from this period reflects the psychological transformation. Earlier paintings showing humans cooperating in mammoth hunts are replaced by images of humans fighting humans. Warriors with weapons designed for killing their own species. Battle scenes that show tactical knowledge sophisticated enough to suggest formal military training. Art historians studying these paintings note something particularly unsettling. The human figures in combat scenes are often depicted with the same level of anatomical detail that earlier artists reserved for prey animals, as if other humans had become just another species to be hunted systematically. But why did this happen? Why did the species that had cooperated so effectively against megafauna suddenly turn that cooperation into a weapon against itself? The answer lies in what happened after we emptied the world of giants. For the first time in human evolutionary history, we faced a problem that no amount of systematic killing could solve. There were no more external threats to unite against, no more giants to hunt, no more competing human species to eliminate. Just us, alone on a planet we'd stripped of everything that had previously given our lives meaning and purpose. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Humans are a species that evolved in response to external threats. Our entire cognitive architecture is built around the assumption that survival requires constant vigilance against competitors, predators, and environmental challenges. When we eliminated all of those external pressures, we didn't become peaceful. We became our own worst enemy. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of what can only be described as systematic boredom warfare. Conflicts that seem to have been initiated not over resources or territory, but simply because fighting was what humans knew how to do. Battle sites where the logistics of organizing combat seem to have been more important than any strategic objective. We'd become so good at killing that we couldn't stop killing, even when there was nothing left that needed to be killed. The fortified settlements tell this story in architectural detail. Defensive works that required months of coordinated labor to construct, protecting resources that could have been easily shared. Weapons stockpiles containing thousands of specialized killing tools, far more than any reasonable defense would require. Evidence of military planning that treated neighboring human settlements like enemy species to be systematically eliminated. We were applying megafauna extinction techniques to the problem of human coexistence, and it was working with horrifying efficiency. Population genetics from this period reveal the mathematical precision of systematic human elimination. Regional populations that had existed for thousands of years vanishing from the DNA record within a few generations. Replacement populations moving into emptied territories with genetic signatures suggesting they'd traveled hundreds of miles to claim land that had been cleared through violence. It wasn't random warfare. It was coordinated demographic replacement using techniques perfected during our war against the giants. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The human groups that were most successful at this systematic elimination weren't necessarily the strongest or most numerous. They were the most systematic about applying industrial killing techniques to human targets. Archaeological evidence shows that successful human exterminators used the same strategic approaches that had worked against mammoths and ground sloths. Coordinated attacks on vulnerable populations. Targeting of reproductive age individuals to prevent population recovery. Systematic destruction of food sources and shelter to force starvation rather than direct confrontation. We'd learned to genocide our own species using lesson plans written during the megafauna extinctions. The cave paintings from this period preserve something that should haunt every modern human. Scenes of human hunters using the same tactical formations against human prey that their ancestors had used against mammoth herds. The same patient stalking techniques, the same coordinated ambush strategies, the same methodical processing of carcasses afterward. The only difference was the species being systematically eliminated. But perhaps most chilling of all, these ancient artists were painting these scenes with obvious pride. These weren't records of unfortunate conflicts or desperate survival measures. They were celebrations of systematic human elimination as a specialized skill that deserved artistic commemoration. We'd made genocide into entertainment. The settlement patterns from this period show the mathematical efficiency of human population replacement, empty territories being reoccupied within years of their original inhabitants vanishing. New populations moving in with technological packages identical to those used by successful human eliminators elsewhere. Evidence of systematic knowledge transfer between groups that specialized in clearing human competitors. It was ethnic cleansing with Stone Age technology, but industrial age organization. The tool assemblages tell their own story. Weapons caches containing specialized human-killing implements found alongside domestic tools in family dwellings. Evidence that systematic murder of other humans had become as routine as food preparation or shelter construction. Children's toys that were miniature versions of human hunting weapons, suggesting that genocide techniques were being taught as normal childhood skills. We were raising our children to be professional human exterminators. The genetic evidence from this period reveals something that should make every modern human question what we're truly capable of. Successful human eliminator populations show evidence of selective breeding for traits that enhanced killing efficiency, increased muscle mass attachments, enhanced hand-eye coordination markers, even cognitive traits associated with reduced empathy for outgroup individuals. We weren't just systematically killing other humans, we were breeding ourselves to become better at it. The archaeological sites from this period preserve evidence of systematic human processing that rivals anything found at mammoth kill sites. Bone middens containing thousands of human remains, all showing identical butchery patterns. Cut marks indicating that human meat was being processed with the same efficiency techniques used on megafauna. Evidence that cannibalism wasn't desperation behavior, but systematic resource extraction. We'd industrialized eating each other. But here's what makes this period truly terrifying. in its implications for modern humanity. The human groups that were most successful at systematic elimination weren't psychopathic monsters driven by bloodlust. They were organized, intelligent, technologically sophisticated societies that had simply applied problem-solving skills to the challenge of human competition. They were us, using the same cognitive abilities that had made us successful against mammoths and cave bears to solve the problem of other humans existing. The settlement archaeology from this period shows evidence of post-conflict societies that functioned normally in every respect, except for their systematic elimination of human competitors. Domestic spaces arranged for comfortable family living. Evidence of art, music, and cultural activities. Signs of technological innovation and trade networks. These weren't savage barbarians, they were suburban genociders who went home to their families after spending the day systematically eliminating neighboring human populations. The implications for understanding modern human psychology are disturbing beyond measure. The same cognitive flexibility that makes us capable of unprecedented cooperation also makes us capable of unprecedented systematic violence. The same technological innovation that allows us to solve complex problems allows us to solve the problem of other humans existing. We are a species that learned to treat genocide as an engineering challenge, and we got very, very good at meeting that challenge. The cave art from this period preserves something that should make every museum visitor pause and consider what they're truly looking at. Paintings of human figures engaged in systematic killing activities with the same careful attention to technical detail that earlier artists used for mammoth hunting scenes. These weren't warnings about violence or moral condemnations of warfare. They were instruction manuals, technical documentation of systematic human elimination techniques preserved for future generations to study and improve upon. We were teaching our descendants how to commit genocide more efficiently. The technological innovation from this period shows systematic improvement in human killing efficiency that parallels our earlier innovations in megafauna hunting. Better weapons, more effective tactics, improved logistics for moving elimination teams across large territories, enhanced techniques for preventing target population recovery. We were applying research and development principles to the problem of making other humans extinct, and it worked. Regional population genetics show that successful human eliminator groups achieve demographic replacement rates that would make modern military strategists envious. Entire cultural and genetic lineages erased from the record within a few generations, replaced by populations carrying the genetic signatures of systematic killers. We'd mastered the art of making human diversity disappear. But here's the most disturbing aspect of this entire period. The archaeological evidence suggests that systematic human elimination wasn't considered morally problematic by the societies practicing it. Weapons designed for killing humans are found in domestic contexts alongside cooking tools and children's toys. Evidence that genocide was considered a normal, even admirable, specialized skill. We'd made systematic murder of our own species into a respectable profession. The question that haunts every archaeologist studying this period is whether this systematic human-on-human violence was an aberration or a revelation. Was this a temporary psychological crisis following megafauna extinction, or was this the first clear demonstration of what humans are actually capable of when external constraints are removed? The evidence suggests the latter. Every technological innovation we developed for killing giants worked even better on humans. Every strategic principle we'd learned from mammoth hunting applied with devastating effectiveness to human elimination. Every psychological trait that had made us successful against megafauna made us terrifyingly efficient at systematic genocide. We weren't becoming monsters. We were revealing what we'd always been capable of becoming. The settlement patterns from the end of this period show the mathematical result of systematic human elimination. Vast territories that had supported diverse human populations for thousands of years, now occupied by genetically homogeneous groups carrying the technological signatures of successful eliminators. We'd achieved what no species in Earth's history had ever accomplished. We'd made our own diversity disappear through systematic application of intelligence to the problem of competition. And we were just getting started. The scream echoed across what would one day become the Swiss Alps. But 300,000 years ago, it cut through air thick with volcanic ash and the trumpeting of creatures that belonged in nightmares. A Neanderthal mother clutched her infant as the ground shook beneath footsteps that registered like seismic events. Above them, something impossible blotted out the sun. The terror bird stood 12 feet tall, its beak designed by evolution to crack skulls like walnuts. But this wasn't South America where these monsters belonged. This was Europe, during a period when continental drift and climate chaos had shuffled life across the planet like cards in a cosmic deck. Welcome to the most alien chapter of our planet's story, when Earth's geography itself was unrecognizable and the rules of survival were being rewritten in real time. The world our ancestors inherited wasn't just populated by different creatures. It was a fundamentally different planet, with different continents, different climates, and different physical laws governing who lived and who died. Understanding this alien Earth is crucial to understanding how we became what we are today. Because the humans who survived this planetary chaos weren't just tough. They were the products of environmental pressures so extreme that they forged cognitive abilities no species had ever possessed before. Let's start with something that will fundamentally alter how you picture the ancient world. The map was wrong. Not just politically wrong, but geographically impossible by modern standards. During the peak of our story, sea levels were 400 feet lower than today. Entire continents existed that are now underwater. Britain was connected to France by hundreds of miles of grassland where the English Channel now flows. The Mediterranean was a series of isolated lakes separated by land bridges. What we call the Red Sea was a river valley you could walk across in an afternoon. But here's what makes this geography truly alien. It was unstable. Volcanic activity during this period was operating on scales that would make modern supervolcano eruptions look like backyard barbecues. The Toba eruption 74,000 years ago released enough ash to bury the entire United States under 3 feet of volcanic debris. The atmospheric impact was so severe that global temperatures dropped by 20 degrees Fahrenheit for decades. Imagine trying to survive in a world where summer simply disappeared for human generations, where crops failed not for seasons, but for decades, where the sky remained dark enough that vitamin D deficiency became a survival trait rather than a health problem. Our ancestors didn't just survive this, they thrived during it. The fossil evidence from volcanic ash layers tells a story that should be impossible. Human populations actually expanding during periods of catastrophic environmental collapse that drove most other species to extinction. Archaeological sites showing technological innovation accelerating during the worst climate disasters in planetary history. We weren't just adapting to catastrophe. We were using catastrophe as an opportunity to outcompete everything else on the planet. But volcanic winters were just one component of an environmental chaos that would challenge everything we think we know about habitability. The magnetic field itself was unstable during this period, fluctuating in ways that exposed the planet's surface to cosmic radiation levels that would sterilize most life forms. Genetic analysis of ancient human remains shows mutation rates during this period that were orders of magnitude higher than normal background levels. Our ancestors were living through evolutionary acceleration powered by cosmic radiation. They weren't just surviving in an alien environment, they were being transformed by it at the cellular level. The implications are staggering. The cognitive abilities that make modern humans unique may not have evolved gradually over millions of years. They may have been forged during a few thousand generations of extreme environmental pressure that rewired our neural architecture through sheer biological necessity. We became intelligent because the planet tried to kill us, and failed. The climate data from this period reads like a planetary fever dream. Ice core analysis reveals temperature swings of 30 degrees Fahrenheit within decades. Ecosystems that have been stable for millions of years, collapsing and reforming within single human lifetimes. Imagine growing up in a tropical rainforest, then watching it transform into Arctic tundra before you reached adulthood. That was normal childhood experience for our ancestors. They didn't have the luxury of assuming environmental stability. They had to develop cognitive flexibility that could adapt to anything the planet threw at them, and the planet was throwing everything. Ocean current analysis from this period shows circulation patterns that defy modern understanding of marine systems. The Gulf Stream, which currently keeps Europe habitable, was flowing in reverse. The Antarctic current was carrying tropical water to polar regions. The entire planetary heat distribution system was operating according to rules that no longer exist. This wasn't gradual climate change. This was planetary systems failure happening in real time, with human ancestors caught in the middle, trying to survive conditions that challenged the basic assumptions of how life works. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Archaeological evidence shows that human technological innovation didn't just continue during these planetary catastrophes. It accelerated beyond anything seen in the previous 2 million years of human evolution. Complex tool traditions that had remained static for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly exploding into diversity. Art appearing for the first time in human history. Symbolic behavior indicating abstract thinking capabilities that wouldn't be seen again until the development of written language. Crisis wasn't limiting human potential, it was unlocking capabilities that had never existed before. The settlement patterns from this period reveal survival strategies that border on the superhuman. Human populations not just persisting through volcanic winters and magnetic field collapses, but actually expanding their range during the worst environmental conditions in planetary history. Sites in Siberia showing human occupation during periods when temperatures were so low that modern Arctic survival gear wouldn't be sufficient. Evidence of humans living in environments where the carbon dioxide levels would be toxic to modern populations. Archaeological proof of sustained human presence in regions where background radiation should have been lethal. Our ancestors weren't just tough, they were operating with biological capabilities that we've apparently lost. The genetic evidence supports this conclusion in ways that should fundamentally alter how we understand human potential. Ancient DNA shows metabolic efficiency rates that are impossible by modern standards. Immune system variants that could handle pathogen loads that would kill contemporary humans within days. But perhaps most remarkably, neural development patterns that suggest cognitive processing capabilities we can barely comprehend today. Brain endocasts from this period show neural architecture that differs significantly from modern human brains. Not smaller or less developed, but organized according to different principles. Enhanced pattern recognition capabilities. Improved spatial reasoning. Most intriguingly, evidence of sensory processing that suggests our ancestors could perceive environmental information we can no longer access. They weren't just surviving in an alien world, they were perceiving that world through senses we've apparently evolved away from. The tool assemblages from this period support this enhanced perception hypothesis. Stone implements showing precision manufacturing that requires understanding of material properties at levels that challenge modern engineering capabilities. Weapons designed with aerodynamic principles that wouldn't be formally discovered until the development of advanced mathematics. Archaeological analysis reveals systematic approaches to resource extraction that demonstrate environmental knowledge so detailed it borders on the supernatural. Hunting techniques that required predicting animal behavior patterns across seasonal cycles that no longer exist. Navigation methods that worked in environments where magnetic compass readings would have been useless. Our ancestors had developed practical expertise that we've replaced with technology because we're no longer capable of the direct environmental interface they possessed. But the most alien aspect of this ancient world wasn't the geography or the climate, or even the enhanced human capabilities. It was the ecosystem dynamics that governed survival. Competition during this period operated according to rules that would make modern ecological theory seem quaint. Species weren't just competing for resources. They were competing for the right to exist in environments that were changing faster than evolutionary adaptation could accommodate. Archaeological sites preserve evidence of what can only be described as ecosystem warfare. Coordinated species elimination efforts that involved multiple predator and prey species working together to exclude competitors from changing habitats. Human remains from this period show evidence of survival strategies that required cooperation with species that should have been natural enemies. Cut marks on bones, suggesting that humans were participating in multi-species hunting coalitions. Tool wear patterns indicating that human weapons were being used to defend territory on behalf of animal partners. We weren't just competing with other species, we were forming military alliances with them against common environmental threats. The fossil record from predator dens during this period reveals something that challenges everything we think we know about ancient ecology. Human artifacts found alongside the remains of species that should have been hunting humans. Evidence of shared shelter usage between humans and apex predators. Cut marks on prey bones, suggesting coordinated hunting between human and animal partners. Our ancestors were operating in ecosystems where the traditional predator-prey relationships had broken down entirely. Environmental pressure was so extreme that species survival required cooperation across evolutionary boundaries that should have been absolute. Cave paintings from this period preserve artistic evidence of these impossible partnerships. Humans depicted hunting alongside cave lions, saber-toothed cats shown sharing kills with human families, ground sloths illustrated as domestic partners rather than prey animals. These weren't fantasy images. They were documentary evidence of ecological relationships that existed nowhere else in evolutionary history. But perhaps most remarkably, genetic analysis suggests that these cross-species partnerships weren't just behavioral, they were biological. Recent DNA extraction techniques have revealed human genetic material that shows influence from species that should have been evolutionarily incompatible with human reproduction. Not through direct interbreeding, which would be biologically impossible, but through horizontal gene transfer mechanisms that we're only beginning to understand. Our ancestors weren't just cooperating with other species, they were exchanging genetic information with them through processes that modern biology considers theoretically impossible. The implications extend beyond archaeology into fundamental questions about the nature of evolution itself. The ancient world our ancestors inhabited operated according to biological rules that we've apparently forgotten or lost access to. Environmental DNA, extracted from ancient sediment layers, shows ecosystem compositions that included species combinations that should have been mutually exclusive. Predators and prey species coexisting in population densities that violate basic ecological mathematics. Plant communities that required soil chemistry conditions that couldn't have existed simultaneously. The ancient world wasn't just alien. It was operating according to natural laws that we no longer understand. Site analysis from this period reveals human settlements that were architecturally integrated with structures created by other species. Not just humans living in caves previously occupied by bears, but evidence of coordinated construction projects involving human and animal labor. Stone arrangements that required lifting capabilities beyond human strength, but showing tool marks consistent with human technology. Defensive earthworks that follow engineering principles optimized for species with different sensory capabilities than humans. Storage systems designed for preserving resources that only certain animal species could access or process. Our ancestors were building infrastructure designed for multi-species communities that shouldn't have been possible to coordinate or maintain. The technological evidence supports this cross-species cooperation hypothesis in ways that border on the fantastic. Tool designs that incorporate understanding of animal anatomy and behavior at levels that suggest direct communication between humans and other species. Weapons that were clearly designed for use by creatures with different limb proportions than humans. hunting implements that required coordination between human tool users and animal partners with specialized tracking or killing capabilities, processing equipment designed for handling resources that humans couldn't access independently. Archaeological analysis suggests that our ancestors had developed communication protocols that allowed them to coordinate complex activities with species that we currently consider to be non-intelligent animals. But the most profound evidence of this alien world comes from the settlement abandonment patterns. Sites that showed thousands of years of successful multi-species occupation suddenly and simultaneously abandoned across entire continents. Not gradually, as climate changed or resources depleted, but abruptly, as if some fundamental organizing principle had collapsed overnight. The timing correlates precisely with the extinction of megafauna species and the genetic bottlenecks that created modern human populations. The end of the alien world wasn't a natural process. It was the result of human cognitive evolution that made cross-species cooperation impossible to maintain. We became too intelligent to share the planet with our former partners. The final archaeological layers from this period preserve evidence that should haunt every modern human. Remains of animal species that had clearly been attempting to maintain abandoned human settlements. Evidence of creatures trying to continue cooperative relationships with humans who were no longer capable of reciprocating. Cut marks on bones suggesting that former animal partners had become prey species as human cognitive development made ecosystem partnership impossible to sustain. Tool assemblages showing the systematic conversion of cooperative implements into weapons designed for eliminating former allies. Our ancestors didn't just abandon the alien world, they systematically destroyed it to prevent themselves from returning to partnerships that their enhanced intelligence had made psychologically impossible. The cave paintings from the final period show this transformation in heartbreaking detail. Earlier images of human-animal cooperation being painted over with scenes of human dominance. Artistic evidence of former partners being redefined as resources or threats rather than allies. The alien world didn't end through natural catastrophe or evolutionary pressure. It ended because we became too human to remain part of it, and in becoming human, we inherited a planet that we had systematically emptied of everything that had once made our existence possible. The question that haunts every researcher studying this period is whether the abilities we gained were worth what we lost. Whether the cognitive capabilities that made us the dominant species on Earth were adequate compensation for the partnerships that had made us successful in the first place. The evidence suggests they weren't, because the human populations that survived the transition from the alien world to the human world weren't the ones that had been most successful at cross-species cooperation. They were the ones that had been most successful at converting former partners into resources. We didn't evolve beyond the alien world. We murdered it. Systematically, deliberately, with the same technological innovation and strategic thinking that had once made us valuable partners to species we would eventually eliminate. The last evidence of the alien world comes from sites that preserve the final attempts at maintaining multi-species partnerships. Archaeological layers showing increasingly desperate efforts to sustain relationships that human cognitive development had made impossible. Animal remains showing evidence of behavioral modification attempts, as if former partners were trying to become more human-like to maintain cooperation. Human artifacts showing technological regression, as if our ancestors were trying to become less cognitively advanced to preserve partnerships they were losing. Neither approach worked. The alien world was ending because we had become incompatible with the biological relationships that had created it. And when it ended, we found ourselves alone on a planet that we had systematically stripped of everything that had once made our survival possible. The genetic bottleneck that followed wasn't caused by environmental catastrophe or disease. It was caused by the psychological trauma of realizing that we had destroyed the only world in which human existence had ever been sustainable. We had become the apex predator of a planet we had made uninhabitable for apex predators. The archaeological evidence from the immediate post-transition period shows human populations struggling with survival challenges that their ancestors had solved through partnerships they could no longer maintain. Technological innovation accelerating as humans tried to replace biological cooperation with mechanical solutions. Art from this period shows humans attempting to recreate through technology the capabilities they had lost through species partnerships. Cave paintings depicting humans with artificial extensions that mimicked animal sensory abilities. Tool designs that tried to compensate for the loss of animal partners through increasingly complex mechanical systems. We were trying to become technologically superhuman because we had made ourselves biologically alone. The settlement patterns from this period reveal the mathematical result of ecosystem partnership collapse. Human populations that had thrived for thousands of years in multi-species communities suddenly facing survival challenges that required entirely new approaches to resource extraction and environmental management. Archaeological sites showing evidence of resource depletion that hadn't been problems when animal partners provided access to food sources that humans couldn't exploit independently. Settlement abandonment patterns indicating that humans were discovering that many environments were uninhabitable without the specialized capabilities that other species had provided. We had gained intelligence, but we had lost the biological partnerships that had made intelligence useful for survival. The cave art from the final transition period preserves something that should make every modern human pause and consider what we've become. Images of humans attempting to communicate with former animal partners who were no longer responding to cooperation attempts. Artistic evidence of humans trying to re-establish relationships that their enhanced cognitive capabilities had made impossible to maintain. Paintings showing humans offering resources to animal species that were now treating humans as predators rather than partners. We had become too intelligent to be trusted by the species we had once depended on for survival. And in that transformation, we had created the modern world. A world where humans exist in isolation from every other species on the planet. Where we've replaced biological cooperation with technological domination. Where we've traded ecosystem partnership for planetary control. The alien world ended 50,000 years ago. We've been trying to compensate for its loss ever since. Every technology we've developed has been an attempt to replace capabilities we lost when we destroyed the partnerships that had made us successful. Every environmental crisis we face is the result of trying to manage planetary systems that we once maintained through cooperation with species we've eliminated. We aren't the descendants of successful human ancestors. We're the descendants of humans who survived the collapse of the only sustainable way of being human that has ever existed. The alien world isn't ancient history. It's the template for the future we'll need to create if we want human civilization to survive the consequences of destroying the biological partnerships that made human existence possible in the first place. But first, we'd have to remember how to share a planet with species we've spent 50,000 years learning to dominate. The child's scream cut through the morning air like a blade through flesh. She was pointing at something that shouldn't exist, something that made her 8-year-old brain struggle to process what her eyes were telling her. There, drinking from the same watering hole where her family gathered each dawn, stood a creature from nightmares that hadn't been invented yet. The short-faced bear turned its massive head toward the sound, and for one frozen moment, predator and prey locked eyes across an impossible distance. 11 feet of muscle and prehistoric fury evaluated a small human with the casual interest of a lion considering an appetizer. But this wasn't Africa. This wasn't even the world as we know it. This was North America, 15,000 years ago, when giants still walked the earth and humans were still learning the most important lesson our species would ever master. Everything could be killed if you were smart enough about it. The archaeological evidence from sites like this one tells a story that should make modern humans deeply uncomfortable. Not because of what our ancestors faced, but because of how systematically they solved the problem of living alongside creatures that evolution had spent millions of years perfecting for the specific purpose of killing things exactly like us. The short-faced bear wasn't just big. It was engineered for terror with a precision that would make military contractors weep with envy. Those impossibly long legs weren't just for height. They were built for sustained speed that could maintain 40 miles per hour across open terrain until whatever it was chasing collapsed from exhaustion. The skull was a bone-crushing engine optimized for generating bite forces that could shatter mammoth femurs like breadsticks. But here's what made these bears truly nightmarish. They were intelligent, patient, strategic. Fossil trackways preserve evidence of hunting behaviors that reveal cognitive capabilities that should terrify anyone who thinks size and intelligence are mutually exclusive. These bears would follow human tracks for days, matching pace exactly, learning travel patterns and preferences. They understood that humans moved in predictable ways, followed water sources, and made camp in defensible locations. They were studying us like we were a particularly interesting species of prey that required specialized hunting techniques. One site in Alaska preserves what can only be described as a prehistoric crime scene. Human footprints showing normal walking pace suddenly transitioning to desperate sprinting. Bear tracks appearing exactly where the human prints change, but with spacing that indicates the bear had been following silently for over a mile before revealing itself. The human prints end at a cliff face. The bear prints continue to the edge, then return to where they started. It had herded a human to a dead end, with the casual efficiency of a border collie managing sheep. The difference was that this sheep had been carrying stone tools and fire-starting equipment. The bear didn't care. Intelligence meant nothing when you were facing something that weighed 3,000 pounds and could outrun a horse. But our ancestors learned. They always learned. Archaeological sites from slightly later periods show evidence of systematic adaptation to short-faced bear predation. Settlement patterns that avoided known bear territories. Fire placement designed to create detection barriers rather than just warmth. Most tellingly, weapon caches positioned at strategic intervals along travel routes, suggesting that humans had developed contingency plans for bear encounters. We were learning to think like prey in order to survive, but we were also learning something else, something that would prove far more important in the long term. We were learning to think like predators. The kill sites from this period reveal hunting strategies that border on the diabolical. Humans had figured out that short-faced bears, for all their size and intelligence, had one fatal weakness. They were territorial. Male bears claimed domains that could span thousands of square miles, and they would defend those territories against other bears with violence that made human warfare look like playground disputes. Archaeological evidence shows that humans learned to manipulate this territorial aggression with surgical precision. Scent marking that would draw competing males into conflict zones. Strategic placement of carrion that would create resource disputes between bears. Most cunningly, the use of controlled fires to create territorial boundary confusions that would trigger bear-on-bear violence. We weren't strong enough to fight these giants directly, so we learned to make them fight each other. The fossil record from bear den sites tells the mathematical result of this strategy. Evidence of increasing intraspecies violence among short-faced bears during the exact period when human populations were expanding into their territories. Skeletal remains showing trauma patterns consistent with bear-on-bear combat, but occurring at frequencies that suggest external manipulation of natural aggression patterns. Humans had weaponized bear psychology against bears themselves. But the most disturbing evidence comes from sites that preserve the final phase of this prehistoric arms race. Archaeological layers showing the systematic conversion of short-faced bear territories into human hunting grounds. Not through direct conquest, but through ecosystem manipulation that made bear survival impossible. Fire patterns that destroyed the vegetation bears depended on for winter denning. Hunting pressure that eliminated the prey species bears needed to sustain their massive caloric requirements. Most devastatingly, the introduction of diseases that spread through bear populations with epidemic efficiency. Humans had learned that you don't need to be stronger than your competitors. You just need to be more systematic about destroying their ability to compete. The last short-faced bears died alone, confused, in environments that had been subtly, but systematically, made uninhabitable for giants. Climate change played a role, but the timing is too precise to be coincidental. These bears vanished from the archaeological record at exactly the moment when human technological and strategic capabilities reached the threshold necessary for ecosystem-level manipulation. We didn't hunt them to extinction. We engineered their extinction through environmental warfare so sophisticated that it took modern archaeologists decades to recognize it as deliberate. The psychological impact on human societies was profound and immediate. For the first time in our evolutionary history, we had successfully eliminated a predator that had been specifically adapted to hunt us. The cognitive implications were staggering. If something that evolution had spent millions of years perfecting for killing humans could be systematically eliminated through strategic thinking, what else could be eliminated? What other competitors, predators, or environmental challenges could be solved through the systematic application of human intelligence? Cave art from immediately after the short-faced bear extinctions shows a dramatic shift in how humans depicted themselves in relationship to their environment. Earlier paintings show humans as small figures in landscapes dominated by giant animals. Post-extinction art shows humans as central figures, with animals reduced to resources or problems to be managed. The psychological relationship had fundamentally inverted. We were no longer participants in nature. We had become its editors. But this cognitive revolution came with costs that we're still paying today. Archaeological evidence from human settlements during this period shows the first systematic evidence of what can only be described as ecological addiction. Human populations that had become dependent on the systematic elimination of environmental challenges rather than adaptation to them. Settlement patterns showing rapid expansion into territories that had been cleared of natural predators, followed by resource depletion when human populations exceeded the carrying capacity of artificially simplified ecosystems. Evidence of increasing violence between human groups competing for territories that had been made artificially safe through predator elimination. We had learned to solve environmental problems through systematic killing, but we hadn't learned what to do when there was nothing left to kill. The mammoth kill sites from this period preserve evidence of hunting behaviors that go beyond subsistence into what can only be described as recreational slaughter. Entire herds ambushed at water sources, with archaeological evidence showing that much of the meat was never processed or consumed. Cut marks indicating selective harvesting of only the most valuable parts, with tons of protein left to rot. Kill sites where the logistics of organizing the hunt seem to have been more important than any nutritional objective. Evidence of competitive hunting between human groups, with success measured by the scale of destruction rather than resource acquisition. We had developed a psychological need to kill things that was independent of any survival requirement. The ground sloth extinction sites tell an even more disturbing story. These 15-foot giants, armed with claws that could disembowel cave bears, were being systematically eliminated by creatures a tenth their size, through what can only be described as psychological torture. Fossil trackways showing sloths spinning in defensive circles, slashing at threats coming from multiple directions. Human footprints maintaining perfect distance outside claw range, forcing the giants to exhaust themselves through defensive reactions to threats that never materialized. Archaeological evidence shows that humans would maintain these stalking patterns for days, forcing ground sloths to burn through their massive energy reserves without ever engaging in direct combat. When the giants finally collapsed from exhaustion, humans would move in for kills that required no risk and minimal effort. We had learned to weaponize patience itself, but perhaps most disturbing of all, we had learned to enjoy it. Cave paintings from this period show human figures engaged in these extended stalking behaviors with obvious artistic attention to technical detail. These weren't records of successful hunts. They were instruction manuals for psychological warfare against megafauna. We were teaching our children how to torture giants to death as efficiently as possible. The saber-toothed cat kill sites reveal the mathematical precision of systematic predator elimination. Archaeological evidence shows that humans had developed hunting strategies specifically designed to target saber-tooth reproduction rather than individual animals. Coordinated attacks on denning sites during breeding seasons. Systematic elimination of pregnant females. Most devastatingly, the targeted killing of cubs using techniques that ensured adult saber-teeth would expend fatal energy attempting rescue operations. We weren't just hunting saber-tooth cats. We were implementing demographic warfare designed to prevent population recovery, even if individual animals survived human predation. The fossil record shows the mathematical result of this strategy. Saber-tooth populations that had been stable for millions of years crashing within centuries of intensive human contact. Not through random predation, but through systematic destruction of reproductive capacity, using techniques that required detailed understanding of saber-tooth social behavior and breeding cycles. Humans had learned to commit species genocide through strategic application of biological knowledge. The cave bear sites tell the cruelest story of all. Rather than hunting these massive predators directly, humans simply took their caves. Archaeological evidence shows systematic occupation of cave bear denning sites, with human settlements designed to make cave bear habitation impossible. Fire placement that filled cave systems with smoke. Noise generation that disrupted bear hibernation cycles. Most devastatingly, the introduction of human scent markers that triggered territorial responses, forcing bears to abandon caves they had used for thousands of years. We didn't need to fight cave bears. We just needed to make their homes uninhabitable. The result was cave bear populations forced into marginal territories where winter survival became impossible. Archaeological evidence shows bears attempting to den in exposed locations where they had no protection from weather or competing predators. Skeletal remains indicating that cave bears were dying of exposure and starvation in environments where they had never needed to survive before. Humans had learned to commit murder through environmental manipulation so subtle that the victims never understood what was killing them. But the most profound transformation was psychological. Archaeological evidence from human settlements during this period shows the first systematic appearance of what can only be described as victory rituals. Ceremonial activities focused on celebrating the elimination of environmental threats rather than successful resource acquisition. Cave paintings depicting not hunting success, but empty landscapes where dangerous animals had once lived. Artifact assemblages suggesting that tools used for megafauna elimination were being preserved as ceremonial objects rather than recycled for practical use. Evidence of storytelling traditions focused on human triumph over natural obstacles rather than human adaptation to environmental challenges. We had developed cultural practices focused on celebrating our ability to make other species extinct. The settlement expansion patterns from this period show the mathematical result of systematic environmental simplification. Human populations spreading into territories that had been made artificially safe through predator elimination, with population densities that would have been impossible in naturally balanced ecosystems. Archaeological evidence shows human settlements in locations that would have been uninhabitable death traps before megafauna elimination. Camps placed in valleys where short-faced bears had previously controlled access. Villages built on migration routes that had been mammoth highways for millions of years. Evidence of human resource extraction in areas that had been too dangerous for human presence just centuries earlier. We had inherited a continent by systematically emptying it of everything that had made human habitation impossible. But inheritance came with responsibilities we were unprepared to handle. Archaeological sites from slightly later periods show evidence of ecological collapse following megafauna elimination. Grassland ecosystems that had been maintained by mammoth grazing converting to forests. Fire regimes changing when the giants who had created firebreaks through their movement patterns vanished. Most dramatically, evidence of climate shifts that resulted from eliminating the biological processes that had regulated atmospheric composition for millions of years. We had gained control of entire ecosystems by destroying the biological mechanisms that made those ecosystems stable. The human populations that survived this transformation weren't the ones that had been most successful at environmental adaptation. They were the ones that had been most successful at environmental destruction. Archaeological evidence shows that human groups with the most sophisticated megafauna elimination techniques became the dominant populations during this period. Genetic analysis reveals that modern human populations carry the DNA signatures of systematic killers rather than environmental adapters. We are literally the descendants of humans who survived by becoming more efficient at making other species extinct than they were at coexisting with them. The final archaeological layers from the megafauna extinction period preserve something that should haunt every modern human. Evidence of human children growing up in environments that their parents had systematically cleared of natural predators, with no understanding of the biological relationships that had made their ancestors' survival possible. Toy weapons designed for hunting animals that no longer existed. Games that simulated conflicts with creatures that had been extinct for generations. Stories that preserved technical knowledge about eliminating environmental threats that children would never encounter. We were raising generations of humans whose survival skills were optimized for destroying a natural world that had already been destroyed. The cave art from this final period shows human figures standing alone in empty landscapes, with artistic attention focused on the absence of other species rather than human achievements. These weren't celebration paintings, they were documentation of loneliness. For the first time in evolutionary history, humans were discovering what it meant to be the only intelligent species on a planet they had systematically emptied of everything else. The psychological impact was immediate and catastrophic. Archaeological evidence shows increasing violence between human groups during the exact period when megafauna extinctions were completed. Settlement patterns indicating that humans were applying megafauna elimination techniques to the problem of competing with other humans. We had learned to solve environmental challenges through systematic killing. When the environment was empty, we turned those techniques on ourselves. The weapon technology from this period shows systematic adaptation of megafauna hunting tools for use against human targets. Spear points designed for penetrating human torsos. Clubs weighted for crushing human skulls. Projectile systems optimized for killing humans at distances that made retaliation impossible. Archaeological evidence suggests that the same human groups that had been most successful at eliminating megafauna became the most successful at eliminating competing human populations. We had become so efficient at systematic killing that we couldn't stop killing even when there was nothing left that needed to be killed. The settlement archaeology from this period reveals the mathematical result of applying megafauna elimination techniques to human competition. Entire regional populations vanishing from the archaeological record within generations. Replacement populations moving into emptied territories, with genetic signatures indicating they had traveled hundreds of miles to claim land that had been cleared through systematic human elimination. We were achieving demographic replacement of human competitors, using the same strategic principles that had worked against mammoths and ground sloths. The cave paintings from this period preserve artistic evidence of systematic human elimination techniques being applied with the same technical precision that earlier artists had used for documenting megafauna hunting strategies. Instruction manuals for human genocide, preserved in stone. We had made the systematic murder of our own species into a specialized skill that deserved artistic documentation and technical refinement. But perhaps, most disturbing of all, genetic analysis suggests that the human populations that were most successful at systematic elimination weren't psychopathic monsters. They were the direct ancestors of everyone alive today. every modern human carries the DNA of systematic killers who survived by becoming more efficient at eliminating competition than their victims were at avoiding elimination. We are all descendants of genociders who turned environmental destruction techniques into tools for human population replacement. The final archaeological evidence from this period shows the mathematical outcome of systematic elimination expertise being applied to human competition. A planet that had supported 7 different human species reduced to 1. Continents that had hosted dozens of distinct human populations consolidated under the control of genetically homogeneous groups, carrying the technological signatures of systematic killers. We had achieved what no species in Earth's history had ever accomplished. We had made human diversity disappear through conscious application of intelligence to the problem of competition. And in achieving that unprecedented victory, we had created the modern world. A world where one human population had systematically eliminated every alternative way of being human. Where environmental destruction had been perfected as a tool for competitive advantage. Where systematic killing had become the foundation of technological civilization. The child who screamed at the short-faced bear 15,000 years ago couldn't know she was witnessing the beginning of the end of the natural world. She couldn't know that her descendants would perfect the techniques necessary to eliminate not just individual predators, but entire categories of life that competed with human interests. She just knew something big and dangerous was looking at her with hungry eyes. By the time her great-great-grandchildren were adults, nothing would ever look at humans with hungry eyes again. We had made sure of that. The question that haunts every archaeologist studying this period is whether the safety we gained was worth the world we destroyed to achieve it. The answer is written in every empty landscape where giants once walked, every silent forest where saber-tooth roars once echoed, every grassland where mammoth herds once thundered across horizons that now contain nothing larger than deer. We traded a world full of dangerous wonders for a world safe enough for human civilization. Whether that was progress or catastrophe depends entirely on what you think human civilization is worth. The answer lies buried in frozen mammoth tusks that still wash up on Siberian beaches, carrying within their ivory rings a record of the last days when giants ruled the earth. Each tusk is a diary written in calcium and time, documenting the final chapter of the megafauna age with the precision of a geological autopsy. Scientists who study these tusks can read individual lives in isotopic detail. One female mammoth's tusk reveals 40 years of migrations across territories larger than modern countries. For decades, she followed ancient routes between summer feeding grounds and winter shelters. Her movements synchronized with seasonal rhythms that had governed mammoth behavior for millions of years. Then, suddenly, the patterns change. The isotopes in her final years tell a different story. She stops migrating. The chemical signatures show she's eating different plants, drinking different water. She's trapped in a shrinking habitat, unable to follow the routes her ancestors had carved across continents. The tusk records her confusion in molecular detail as familiar landscapes transform into alien environments where mammoth survival becomes impossible. She died where mammoths had never lived before, confused and isolated in an ecosystem that no longer made sense. Her story is written in every mammoth tusk that emerges from thawing permafrost. Millions of individual tragedies, each documenting the systematic collapse of biological relationships that had sustained giant animals for millions of years. But the tusks tell another story too. One that reveals how human intelligence became the most devastating force in planetary history. The archaeological sites where these tusks are found preserve evidence of hunting strategies so sophisticated they border on the supernatural. Humans had learned to read mammoth behavior with such precision that they could predict individual animal movements months in advance. Kill sites show evidence of ambush locations selected based on understanding of mammoth psychology that would challenge modern animal behaviorists. Hunters who could anticipate where specific mammoth families would be during specific weather conditions. Who understood mammoth social hierarchies well enough to target matriarchs whose deaths would cause entire herds to abandon territories they'd occupied for centuries. Who had developed techniques for manipulating mammoth migration routes through strategic placement of fires and scent markers. This wasn't hunting anymore. This was behavioral engineering applied to species elimination. The bone middens from these sites reveal the mathematical precision of systematic megafauna processing. Archaeological evidence shows that humans had developed industrial approaches to extracting resources from giant animals. Specialized tools for different stages of butchery. Systematic approaches to preserving meat that required understanding of chemistry and biology that wouldn't be formally discovered for thousands of years. But here's what makes these sites truly chilling. The humans weren't just killing mammoths for food. They were killing them for the psychological satisfaction of proving that anything could be eliminated if you applied enough intelligence to the problem. Cut marks on mammoth bones show selective harvesting that left massive amounts of meat to rot. Kill sites where the logistics of organizing the hunt seem to have been more important than any practical objective. Evidence of competitive mammoth killing between human groups, with success measured by the scale of destruction rather than resource acquisition. Humans had developed a pathological need to prove their dominance over nature by systematically eliminating everything that challenged human supremacy. The mammoth kill sites from the final extinction period preserve evidence of hunting behaviors that can only be described as recreational genocide. Entire mammoth populations eliminated not because humans needed the resources, but because mammoth existence had become psychologically intolerable to a species that had learned to solve every problem through systematic killing. Archaeological analysis shows that late-period mammoth hunters were using techniques designed to maximize mammoth suffering rather than hunting efficiency. Spear wounds positioned to cause slow death through blood loss rather than quick kills. Evidence of humans following wounded mammoths for days, maintaining stalking pressure that prevented healing or escape. They were torturing mammoths to death for entertainment. The final mammoth populations retreated to islands where human technology couldn't initially follow them. Wrangel Island, off the Siberian coast, became the last refuge for creatures whose ancestors had dominated entire continents. The island mammoth bones tell a story that should break the heart of anyone who understands what extinction actually means. Isolated for thousands of years, the Wrangel mammoths became smaller, weaker, genetically compromised through inbreeding. But they persisted, maintaining mammoth social structures and behaviors on their Arctic refuge, while the rest of the planet was systematically emptied of giants. The genetic analysis of these final mammoths reveals something heartbreaking. They retained the intelligence and social complexity of their continental ancestors, but they were trapped in bodies that evolution was slowly breaking down through genetic isolation. They knew they were the last of their kind, but they couldn't understand why the world had abandoned them. Their bones show evidence of desperate attempts to maintain mammoth culture, even as their population crashed toward extinction. Defensive formations around juveniles that served no purpose when there were no predators left to defend against. Migration patterns that led nowhere because there was nowhere left for mammoths to migrate to. They died performing behaviors that had once made sense in a world full of mammoths, but which had become meaningless rituals in a world that humans had redesigned for human convenience. The last mammoth died 4,000 years ago, alone on Wrangel Island, looking toward a mainland that had been systematically cleared of everything she needed to survive. Her death marked the end of a lineage that stretched back 5 million years, but more importantly, it marked the completion of humanity's first planetary engineering project. We had successfully eliminated an entire category of life that competed with human interests. But the mammoth extinctions were just the beginning of a systematic campaign that would reshape every ecosystem on Earth. Archaeological sites across every continent preserve evidence of similar elimination patterns applied to every species that challenged human dominance. Ground sloth kill sites in South America show the same recreational torture techniques used on mammoths in the north, systematic stalking patterns designed to exhaust 15-foot giants through psychological pressure rather than direct confrontation. Evidence of humans maintaining stalking pressure for weeks, forcing ground sloths to burn through energy reserves until they collapsed from starvation and exhaustion. Archaeological analysis reveals that humans had learned to weaponize patience itself as a tool for species elimination. The cave bear extinction sites in Europe tell an even more disturbing story. Rather than hunting these massive predators directly, humans discovered they could eliminate them through environmental manipulation, so subtle that the bears never understood what was killing them. Systematic occupation of cave bear denning sites, strategic placement of human scent markers that triggered territorial responses, forcing bears to abandon caves they'd used for millennia, introduction of noise and fire patterns that disrupted hibernation cycles, making winter survival impossible. Humans had learned to commit murder through environmental modification so sophisticated that it left no evidence of direct violence. The saber-toothed cat elimination sites reveal the mathematical precision of demographic warfare applied to apex predators. Archaeological evidence shows that humans had developed hunting strategies specifically designed to target saber-tooth reproduction rather than individual animals. Coordinated attacks on denning sites during breeding seasons, systematic elimination of pregnant females using techniques that maximized energy expenditure by adult cats attempting rescue operations. Most devastatingly, the targeted killing of cubs in ways that ensured parental saber-tooths would waste fatal energy on futile rescue attempts. Humans weren't just hunting saber-toothed cats. They were implementing biological warfare designed to prevent population recovery, even if individual predators survived human attacks. The mathematical result was inevitable. Saber-tooth populations that had been stable for millions of years collapsed within centuries of intensive human contact. Not through random predation, but through systematic destruction of reproductive capacity using techniques that required detailed understanding of saber-tooth behavioral psychology. We had learned to commit species genocide through strategic application of biological knowledge. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from sites that preserve the final phase of megafauna elimination. Archaeological layers showing the systematic conversion of extinction techniques into tools for eliminating competing human populations. The same strategic principles that had worked against mammoths and ground sloths were being applied to the problem of other humans existing in territories that successful human eliminators wanted to claim. Weapon technology from this period shows direct adaptation of megafauna hunting tools for use against human targets. Spear points designed for penetrating human anatomy, projectile systems optimized for killing humans at distances that made retaliation impossible. Most chillingly, evidence of systematic human processing using the same butchery techniques that had been perfected on giant animals. Archaeological sites preserve evidence of human elimination operations conducted with the same industrial efficiency that had been used for mammoth processing. Bone middens containing thousands of human remains, showing identical cut-mark patterns. Evidence of systematic resource extraction from human victims using techniques that had been developed for maximizing yield from megafauna carcasses. Humans had become so proficient at systematic killing that they couldn't stop killing even when the only targets left were members of their own species. The settlement patterns from this period reveal the mathematical outcome of applying megafauna elimination expertise to human competition. Entire regional populations vanishing from the archaeological record within generations. Replacement populations moving into emptied territories with genetic signatures, indicating they had traveled vast distances to claim lands that had been cleared through systematic human elimination. We were achieving demographic replacement of human competitors using the same strategic principles that had emptied continents of giant animals. The cave art from this period preserves artistic documentation of systematic human elimination techniques being applied with the same technical precision that earlier artists had used for megafauna hunting instruction. These weren't moral condemnations of violence or warnings about warfare. They were technical manuals for human genocide, preserved in stone for future generations to study and improve upon. We had made the systematic murder of our own species into a specialized skill that deserved artistic documentation and technical refinement. The genetic evidence from this period supports what the archaeological record suggests with mathematical precision. Population bottlenecks so severe that entire regional populations vanished from the DNA record, not through disease or climate change, but through systematic elimination by other humans, who then replaced them completely. It's the same pattern documented in mammoth and saber-tooth extinctions, but accelerated and intensified through application to intraspecies competition. Modern humans aren't the descendants of the most cooperative or environmentally adapted populations from this period. We're the descendants of the most systematically violent. Genetic analysis reveals that contemporary human populations carry the DNA signatures of groups that survived by becoming more efficient at eliminating human competitors than their victims were at avoiding elimination. Every person alive today is descended from systematic killers who perfected genocide as a survival strategy. But the psychological impact of this transformation extends far beyond individual ancestry. Archaeological evidence from human settlements during this period shows the first systematic appearance of what can only be described as victory culture. Social practices focused on celebrating the elimination of environmental challenges rather than adaptation to them. Settlement patterns showing rapid expansion into territories that had been artificially cleared of natural predators, followed by resource depletion, when human populations exceeded the carrying capacity of ecosystems that had been simplified through species elimination. Artifact assemblages, suggesting that tools used for megafauna and human elimination were being preserved as ceremonial objects rather than recycled for practical purposes. Evidence of storytelling traditions focused on human triumph over natural obstacles rather than human cooperation with environmental systems. We had developed cultural practices specifically designed to celebrate our ability to make other species and human populations extinct. The final archaeological layers from this period preserve something that should haunt every modern human who encounters them. Evidence of children growing up in environments that their parents had systematically cleared of every natural challenge, with no understanding of the biological relationships that had made their ancestors' survival possible. Toy weapons designed for hunting animals that no longer existed. Games that simulated conflicts with creatures that had been extinct for generations. Educational systems that preserved technical knowledge about eliminating environmental threats that children would never encounter because their parents had already eliminated them. We were raising generations of humans whose cognitive development was optimized for destroying a natural world that had already been destroyed. The cave paintings from this final period show human figures standing alone in empty landscapes, with artistic attention focused on the absence of other species rather than human achievements. These weren't celebration images, they were documentation of isolation. For the first time in evolutionary history, humans were discovering what it meant to be the only intelligent species on a planet they had systematically emptied of everything else. The psychological trauma was immediate and profound. Archaeological evidence shows that human populations began applying megafauna elimination techniques to competing human groups at exactly the moment when megafauna extinctions were completed. We had learned to solve environmental problems through systematic killing. When there were no environmental problems left to solve, we created human problems that could be solved through the same techniques. The weapon technology, settlement patterns, and genetic evidence from this period all point to the same disturbing conclusion. The human populations that were most successful at systematic environmental destruction became the ancestors of everyone alive today. We didn't evolve beyond our capacity for systematic violence. We perfected it to the point where it became the foundation of human civilization. The child who screamed at the short-faced bear couldn't know she was witnessing the beginning of a transformation that would culminate in planetary dominance achieved through systematic elimination of every alternative to human control. She just knew something dangerous was looking at her. 15,000 years later, nothing looks at humans as potential prey anymore. We eliminated everything capable of that perspective. Whether that represents progress or catastrophe depends entirely on what you think was lost when we made ourselves the only species on Earth capable of conscious choice about which other species deserve to exist. The mammoth tusks still wash up on beaches, carrying their isotopic records of the last days when giants walked among us. They're evidence of a world we systematically destroyed to create the safety necessary for human civilization. Every modern convenience exists because our ancestors learned to solve the problem of environmental challenge through environmental elimination. Every empty landscape where giants once grazed is a monument to human intelligence applied with systematic precision to the problem of competition. Every silent forest where saber-tooth roars once echoed is proof that anything can be eliminated if you're methodical enough about applying violence to biological systems. We inherited a planet by making it uninhabitable for everything that wasn't us. The question that should keep every modern human awake at night is whether the world we created through systematic elimination is sustainable without the biological relationships we destroyed to create it. Because the techniques that made us the dominant species on Earth are the same techniques that are currently making Earth uninhabitable for the dominant species. The mammoth tusks tell one final story that we're only beginning to understand. The isotopic records from their final years don't just document individual mammoth deaths. They document the collapse of planetary systems that had regulated atmospheric composition, soil chemistry, and climate stability for millions of years. We didn't just eliminate competitors. We eliminated the biological infrastructure that made our own existence possible. The giants are gone. The planet they maintained is disappearing. And we're discovering that intelligence sufficient to destroy a world isn't automatically sufficient to maintain the world you create through destruction. The last mammoth died looking toward a future she couldn't survive. We're living in that future now. The forensic evidence carved into mammoth bones tells us something that should make every modern human pause and consider what we've truly inherited. But it's not just what we gain that matters. It's what we lost in the process of gaining it. Because while we were perfecting the art of systematic elimination, something extraordinary was disappearing from human consciousness. Something that archaeological sites preserve in fragments so tantalizing that researchers spend entire careers trying to understand what we once possessed and can no longer access. The cave paintings at Lascaux aren't just pretty pictures drawn by bored prehistoric artists. They're technical documentation of cognitive abilities that no modern human possesses. The level of anatomical accuracy in these paintings requires direct observation skills that challenge everything we think we know about human perception. Artists working by flickering firelight created images of mammoth musculature that wouldn't be matched by scientific illustration until the development of high-resolution photography. They painted bison with anatomical detail so precise that modern veterinarians use these images as reference guides for understanding extinct species anatomy. But here's what should make your skin crawl with recognition of what we've lost. These artists were painting moving animals in complete darkness with perfect accuracy. They were observing and recording biological information through sensory capabilities that we've apparently evolved away from. Archaeological analysis of these cave painting sites reveals something even more disturbing. The artists weren't just observing animals, they were predicting animal behavior with supernatural precision. Paintings that show mammoth herd movements that wouldn't occur for months after the artwork was completed. Images of seasonal animal behavior, changes that required understanding of biological cycles that modern science is still trying to decode. Our ancestors possessed environmental awareness that bordered on precognition. They could read landscape and weather patterns with accuracy that made long-term survival planning possible, in ways that we can barely comprehend today. But systematic elimination of megafauna didn't just remove giant animals from ecosystems. It removed the biological relationships that had made enhanced human perception necessary for survival. When mammoths disappeared, humans lost the need to track mammoth behavior. When saber-toothed cats vanished, the cognitive abilities required for avoiding ambush predation became useless. When cave bears were eliminated, the enhanced spatial awareness necessary for navigating shared territories with intelligent competitors atrophied through disuse. We gained safety, but we lost the sensory capabilities that had made us successful in dangerous environments. The tool assemblages from pre-extinction sites show manufacturing precision that requires hand-eye coordination capabilities that no modern human possesses. Stone implements shaped with tolerances that challenge contemporary precision engineering. Weapons balanced with mathematical accuracy that suggests understanding of physics principles that wouldn't be formally discovered for millennia. Archaeological experiments attempting to replicate these tools using traditional techniques consistently fail to achieve the precision standards that our ancestors considered routine. Not because we lack intelligence, but because we lack the direct sensory interface with materials that systematic environmental simplification has made unnecessary. Our ancestors could feel stone grain structure through their fingertips. They could hear the acoustic signatures that indicated optimal napping angles. They could smell the chemical composition of different clay types and adjust their pottery techniques accordingly. These weren't mystical abilities. They were practical skills developed through evolutionary pressure that required direct biological interface with complex environments. Skills that became obsolete when we simplified those environments through systematic species elimination. The settlement patterns from pre-extinction sites reveal navigation capabilities that suggest our ancestors possessed magnetic field sensitivity that we've completely lost. Archaeological evidence shows human migrations across unmarked terrain with precision that rivals modern GPS navigation. Routes planned across thousands of miles of wilderness with mathematical accuracy that required environmental awareness we can no longer access. They could feel magnetic field variations through specialized neural structures that archaeological evidence suggests were standard human anatomy until relatively recently. Brain endocasts from this period show neural architecture that differs significantly from modern human brains in areas associated with environmental perception. We didn't just lose the ability to navigate without technology, we lost the biological equipment that made such navigation possible. But perhaps most remarkably, genetic analysis suggests that our ancestors possessed communication abilities that extended far beyond spoken language. DNA evidence points to sensory structures that would have allowed detection of electromagnetic signatures generated by other humans at distances measured in miles rather than meters. Archaeological sites preserve evidence of coordinated human activities across territories so vast that acoustic or visual communication would have been impossible. Hunting strategies that required real-time coordination between groups separated by geographic obstacles that should have made tactical cooperation impossible using any communication methods we currently understand. They were operating with biological communication networks that we've apparently evolved away from in favor of technological substitutes. The cave art from this period preserves something that should fundamentally alter how we understand human potential. Images that appear to be random abstract patterns when viewed under normal lighting conditions, but which resolve into detailed environmental maps when illuminated with specific wavelengths that match the electromagnetic signatures our ancestors could apparently perceive directly. These weren't decorative artworks. They were technical documentation created using sensory capabilities that we've traded away for the safety of simplified environments. The elimination of megafauna didn't just remove large animals from human experience. It removed the evolutionary pressure that had maintained extraordinary human capabilities for millions of years. When environmental challenges disappeared, the biological systems necessary for meeting those challenges atrophied through disuse. Archaeological evidence suggests that this cognitive regression happened with startling speed. Sites showing sophisticated environmental awareness capabilities followed within centuries by settlements where humans were clearly struggling with basic survival challenges that their ancestors had solved routinely. The transition from enhanced human capabilities to technological dependence wasn't gradual. It was catastrophic cognitive collapse, masked by the development of tools that compensated for abilities we were rapidly losing. But the most disturbing evidence comes from sites that preserve the final attempts to maintain enhanced human capabilities in environments that no longer required them. Archaeological layers showing increasingly desperate efforts to preserve knowledge and skills that were becoming irrelevant in artificially simplified ecosystems. Training sites where adults were attempting to teach children sensory capabilities that the children could no longer develop because the environmental stimuli necessary for such development had been systematically eliminated. We weren't just losing touch with nature, we were losing the biological ability to maintain contact with natural systems that our ancestors had navigated as easily as we navigate shopping malls. The genetic evidence from this period reveals something that should make every modern human question what we've truly gained through technological advancement. DNA sequences that show systematic loss of sensory capabilities over remarkably short time periods. Not gradual evolutionary change, but rapid genetic regression as biological systems that were no longer necessary for survival in simplified environments were abandoned through selective pressure that favored technological adaptation over biological capability. We became dependent on tools not because tools were superior to biological capabilities, but because we were losing the biological capabilities that had made tools unnecessary. The archaeological sites from immediately after megafauna extinction show human settlements that were clearly struggling with environmental management challenges that pre-extinction populations had handled routinely. Evidence of crop failures in regions where earlier populations had maintained stable agriculture for thousands of years. Settlement abandonment patterns indicating that humans were discovering that many environments were uninhabitable without the biological capabilities that had been maintained through evolutionary pressure from megafauna interaction. We had gained control of ecosystems by eliminating the species that had forced us to develop the capabilities necessary for understanding how ecosystems actually functioned. The cave paintings from this transition period preserve something that reads like a species-wide lament for lost abilities. Images showing humans attempting to recreate through technology the capabilities they had possessed through direct biological interface with their environments. Artistic documentation of humans using mechanical devices to achieve sensory awareness that their ancestors had possessed naturally. Paintings depicting technological substitutes for biological capabilities that had been lost through environmental simplification. We weren't just creating tools, we were trying to rebuild ourselves mechanically because we had lost the biological architecture that had made mechanical substitutes unnecessary. The tool evolution from this period shows systematic attempts to compensate for lost human capabilities through increasingly sophisticated technological solutions. Weapons designed to replace lost predator awareness, navigation instruments created to substitute for magnetic field sensitivity that humans had once possessed naturally. Archaeological evidence suggests that every major technological innovation from this period was developed as a substitute for biological capabilities that environmental simplification had made obsolete. We weren't advancing beyond our biological limitations. We were creating technological prosthetics for abilities we had systematically eliminated through environmental destruction. The settlement archaeology from this period reveals the mathematical result of trading biological capabilities for environmental control. Human populations that had thrived in complex ecosystems suddenly struggling with survival challenges in the simplified environments they had created. Archaeological evidence shows increasing dependence on technological solutions for problems that pre-extinction populations had solved through direct biological interface with their surroundings. Tool assemblages becoming more complex as human capabilities became more limited. We were discovering that environmental control achieved through species elimination required technological sophistication to maintain what biological adaptation had provided automatically. But perhaps most disturbing of all, the genetic evidence suggests that the loss of enhanced human capabilities wasn't reversible. DNA analysis shows that the biological architecture necessary for direct environmental interface had been compromised through selective pressure that favored technological dependence over biological capability. We hadn't just chosen technology over biology. We had made biological capability impossible to recover through evolutionary adaptation that had permanently altered human neural architecture. The cave art from the final transition period shows humans attempting to preserve through artistic documentation the knowledge of capabilities they could no longer access. Technical instruction manuals for sensory abilities that children could no longer develop. These weren't historical records. They were desperate attempts to maintain connection with human potential that environmental simplification had made impossible to sustain. We were trying to remember how to be human in ways that systematic environmental destruction had made biologically impossible. The archaeological evidence from this period forces an uncomfortable conclusion about what human technological advancement actually represents. Every tool we developed was compensation for biological capability that environmental simplification had eliminated. Every technological solution was admission that we had traded irreplaceable biological potential for temporary environmental control. The question that haunts researchers studying this transition is whether the exchange was worth the cost. Whether the safety and convenience of technologically mediated existence adequately compensates for the loss of biological capabilities that had made our ancestors successful in complex environments for millions of years. The answer is written in every modern human who struggles with basic environmental awareness that our ancestors possessed instinctively. Every person who needs GPS to navigate terrain that pre-technological humans crossed without hesitation. Every individual who requires weather forecasting to predict atmospheric changes that our ancestors could feel in their bones. We gained the ability to control our environment, but we lost the ability to understand the environment we were controlling. The archaeological sites preserve evidence of what we once were. The genetic analysis reveals what we've become. The question that remains is whether what we've become is sustainable without the biological relationships we destroyed to achieve it. Because the enhanced human capabilities that systematic environmental destruction eliminated weren't luxuries. They were the biological infrastructure that had made human survival possible in complex ecosystems for millions of years. We traded them for temporary safety in simplified environments. Now we're discovering that the simplified environments aren't sustainable without the complex biological relationships we eliminated to create them. The cave paintings preserve one final message that every modern human should understand. Images showing our ancestors looking toward a future they could predict through sensory capabilities we no longer possess. They could see what was coming. They painted warnings that we lack the biological equipment to interpret. We're living in the future they tried to warn us about. We just lost the ability to understand their warnings when we lost the sensory capabilities that made such warnings possible. The greatest tragedy isn't that we eliminated the giants. It's that in eliminating them, we eliminated the parts of ourselves that had made coexistence with giants possible. We became the only intelligent species on Earth, but we lost the intelligence that had made us successful as one species among many. The question that should terrify every modern human is whether the intelligence we retained is sufficient for managing a planet that we modified using capabilities we no longer possess. The cave paintings suggest it isn't. They show environmental changes that our ancestors could predict through biological awareness that we've traded for technological dependence. They could see the future. We can barely understand the present. That might be the real reason the giants died. Not because we were smarter, but because we were willing to become less intelligent in order to become more systematically violent. We won by making ourselves incapable of understanding what we were destroying. And now we're living with the consequences of victories achieved through voluntary cognitive regression. The giants are gone. The humans who could have coexisted with them are gone too. What remains is us. The descendants of systematic destroyers trying to manage a planet using abilities that are inadequate for the task we've inherited. The archaeological evidence suggests we're failing. The genetic analysis suggests we can't recover the capabilities we would need to succeed. The cave paintings suggest our ancestors knew this would happen. They tried to warn us. We just lost the ability to understand their warnings when we chose systematic destruction over biological capability. Welcome to the future the giants saw coming. The future where intelligence insufficient to sustain what intelligence created becomes the last chapter of the human story. Unless we can remember how to be human in ways that our ancestors understood and we've forgotten, the clock is ticking. And we're discovering that time moves differently when you've eliminated your ability to perceive it properly. The bone needle tells a story that archaeologists are still afraid to publish. Found in a Siberian cave dated to 45,000 years ago, it's perfectly crafted from mammoth ivory, with an eye so small it requires magnification to see clearly. The threading hole was drilled with precision that modern manufacturing would struggle to replicate using hand tools. But here's what makes this needle truly disturbing. The microscopic analysis reveals it was used to sew materials that don't exist anymore. Fibers from plants that went extinct when the megafauna disappeared. Thread made from animal sinews that came from creatures we systematically eliminated. Our ancestors weren't just making clothes. They were engineering survival systems using biological resources that we destroyed before we could understand how they worked. The needle represents something that should fundamentally change how we think about prehistoric technology. These weren't primitive people making crude approximations of useful tools. They were sophisticated engineers working with biological materials that provided capabilities we've never been able to replicate artificially. Archaeological analysis of preserved textiles from this period reveals fabric construction that utilized fiber combinations we didn't know were possible until the development of advanced materials science, weaving patterns that created insulation properties superior to modern synthetic materials, thread treatments that provided waterproofing, fire resistance, and antimicrobial protection using purely biological processes. They were creating technical textiles that outperformed contemporary materials using nothing but extinct plants and eliminated animals. But the needle tells a darker story too. Chemical analysis reveals that it recently rediscovered. Microsc was also used for surgical procedures that required anatomical knowledge, with only opic traces of human tissue, indicating that our ancestors were performing medical operations with precision that challenged modern surgical standards. Not emergency field medicine, but planned procedures that required understanding of human anatomy that wouldn't be formally documented for thousands of years. The bone surfaces show wear patterns consistent with suturing techniques that modern surgeons train for years to master. Evidence of procedures performed on living patients who survived operations that would challenge contemporary medical facilities. They weren't just tough enough to survive in a world full of giants. They were medically sophisticated enough to repair damage that giants inflicted. Archaeological sites from this period preserve evidence of medical knowledge that borders on the impossible. Surgical toolkits containing instruments designed for specific anatomical procedures. Bone sets indicating that our ancestors could repair complex fractures using techniques that modern orthopedic surgery has only recently developed. Most disturbing of all, evidence of brain surgery performed with stone tools that achieved success rates comparable to modern neurosurgical procedures. The skull from Shanidar Cave shows clear evidence of successful trepanation performed on a living patient who survived for years after the operation. The bone healing patterns indicate not just survival, but recovery that allowed normal physical activity, despite having a portion of skull removed using flint knives. Archaeological analysis reveals that the procedure was performed to relieve pressure from what appears to have been a traumatic brain injury caused by cave bear attack. The patient lived for decades after surgery that would challenge modern neurosurgeons using contemporary equipment. They were performing brain surgery in caves using Stone Age technology, and achieving survival rates that wouldn't be matched until the development of sterile surgical environments. But here's what makes this evidence truly chilling. The medical knowledge preserved in these archaeological sites wasn't learned through experimentation or gradual development. Chemical analysis suggests it was inherited from even earlier populations who possessed biological understanding that we've never been able to replicate. Genetic analysis of ancient human remains shows evidence of medical treatments that required pharmaceutical knowledge that we're still trying to decode. Bone chemistry indicating exposure to plant-based compounds that provided antibiotic, analgesic, and anti-inflammatory effects using species that went extinct before we could study their properties. Our ancestors had access to natural pharmacies that we eliminated before we could understand how they worked. The implications extend far beyond medical history into fundamental questions about what we lost when we systematically simplified our environment. Archaeological evidence suggests that complex ecosystems provided biological resources that enabled capabilities we've had capabilities possible. Every modern medical procedure ISD to replace with technology because we destroyed the natural systems that made such an attempt to replicate through artificial means. What our ancestors achieved using biological resources, we eliminated through environmental destruction. The bone needle represents something even more profound than lost medical knowledge. Microscopic analysis reveals that it was manufactured using techniques that required understanding of ivory structure at the molecular level. The drilling patterns show awareness of stress distribution that prevented cracking during use. They understood materials science principles that wouldn't be formally discovered until the development of electron microscopy. But they didn't discover these principles through scientific research. They inherited them from populations that had developed such knowledge through direct biological interface with complex environments over millions of years. Archaeological evidence suggests that systematic environmental destruction didn't just eliminate species. It eliminated the biological relationships that had made advanced human capabilities possible. The cave paintings from this period preserve artistic documentation of knowledge systems that we can no longer decode. Technical diagrams showing anatomical information that appears to have been recorded through direct sensory observation rather than dissection or experimentation. Images of internal organ structures that are anatomically accurate to degrees that challenge modern medical illustration. Paintings of circulatory systems that show blood flow patterns that wouldn't be understood until the development of advanced imaging technology. They could see inside living bodies without cutting them open. Archaeological sites preserve evidence of diagnostic capabilities that required sensory awareness we've apparently lost through evolutionary regression. Tool assemblages indicating that our ancestors could detect internal injuries through techniques that modern medicine has never been able to replicate. Bone analysis showing that they could identify specific medical conditions through observation methods that we can't understand using contemporary sensory capabilities. They possessed biological diagnostic equipment that we've replaced with machines because we lost the ability to perceive what they could detect directly. But the most disturbing evidence comes from sites that preserve the final attempts to maintain advanced medical knowledge in environments that no longer supported the biological relationships necessary for such knowledge. Archaeological layers showing increasingly desperate efforts to preserve surgical techniques that were becoming impossible to practice as the species that provided necessary materials were systematically eliminated. Medical tool assemblages becoming simpler over time as complex procedures became impossible due to resource unavailability rather than knowledge loss. They didn't forget how to perform advanced surgery. They lost access to the biological materials that made advanced surgery possible. The genetic evidence from this period reveals something that should make every modern human question what medical advancement actually represents. DNA sequences showing systematic loss of sensory capabilities that had enabled direct biological interface with physiological systems. Not gradual evolutionary change, but rapid genetic regression as biological systems that were no longer necessary for survival in simplified environments were abandoned through selective pressure that favored technological dependence over biological capability. We developed medical technology not because technology was superior to biological capability, but because we were losing the biological capabilities that had made technological substitutes unnecessary. The archaeological sites from immediately after megafauna extinction show human populations struggling with medical challenges that earlier populations had solved routinely. Evidence of disease outbreaks in regions where pre-extinction populations had maintained stable health for thousands of years. Settlement abandonment patterns indicating that humans were discovering that many environments were medically uninhabitable without the biological resources that had been eliminated through species destruction. We had gained control of ecosystems by destroying the biological pharmacy that had made human health maintenance possible in complex environments. The bone needle tells one final story that every modern human should understand. Chemical analysis reveals that its final use was an attempt to repair damage that could no longer be repaired because the materials necessary for repair had been eliminated along with the megafauna. It was used to attempt surgical procedures that had become impossible due to resource unavailability rather than knowledge limitations. Our ancestors knew how to fix what was broken. They just lost access to the biological materials that made repair possible. The needle was abandoned not because it was no longer useful, but because the world it was designed for had been systematically destroyed. Modern medicine represents our attempt to recreate through artificial means what our ancestors achieved using biological resources we eliminated before we understood their value. Every hospital is a monument to capabilities we lost when we chose environmental simplification over biological complexity. Every pharmaceutical compound is an artificial substitute for natural resources that we destroyed through systematic species elimination. The bone needle reminds us that advanced human capabilities weren't primitive approximations of modern technology. They were sophisticated solutions that worked better than contemporary alternatives because they were integrated with biological systems we've eliminated. We didn't advance beyond our ancestors' medical knowledge. We created artificial substitutes for biological capabilities that environmental destruction had made impossible to maintain. The question that should haunt every modern human is whether our artificial substitutes are adequate for maintaining the health necessary for long-term survival in environments that we've modified using capabilities we no longer possess. The archaeological evidence suggests they aren't. The genetic analysis suggests we can't recover the biological capabilities we would need to maintain health without technological dependence. The bone needle suggests our ancestors knew this would happen. They tried to preserve the knowledge necessary for biological health maintenance in a world where such maintenance would become impossible. We found their tools. We just lost the ability to use them properly when we eliminated the biological systems they were designed to interface with. Welcome to the future where artificial medical technology compensates for biological health maintenance capabilities that systematic environmental destruction eliminated. The needle is still sharp. We just cut away our ability to thread it with materials that actually worked. And now we're discovering that synthetic alternatives aren't adequate substitutes for biological systems that took millions of years to develop and seconds to destroy. The giants provided more than just meat and hides. They provided the biological infrastructure that made advanced human capabilities possible. We eliminated them, and in doing so, we eliminated the parts of ourselves that had made coexistence with complexity possible. The bone needle is evidence of what we once were. The fact that we can't replicate its capabilities using modern technology is evidence of what we've become. The question that remains is whether what we've become is sustainable without the biological relationships we destroyed to achieve it. The needle suggests it isn't. It was designed for a world that worked differently than the world we created through systematic elimination. A world where human capabilities were adequate for the challenges human existence created. We're discovering that the challenges we've created require capabilities we eliminated when we chose destruction over cooperation. The bone needle tells us what we lost. The empty landscapes tell us what we gained. Whether the exchange was worthwhile depends entirely on what you think human civilization is worth, and whether you believe artificial substitutes can permanently replace biological systems that took millions of years to perfect? The needle suggests they can't. It was made for threading connections between humans and the biological world that sustained human existence. We cut those connections. And now we're discovering that the synthetic threads we've substituted aren't strong enough to hold the fabric of human civilization together. The bone needle is still functional. We're the ones who broke. So here we are, 300,000 years after that first gathering at the watering hole, living in the world our ancestors created through systematic elimination of everything that challenged human dominance. We've traded a planet teeming with giants, mysteries, and impossible partnerships for one that's safe enough for shopping malls and smartphones. Every empty landscape where mammoths once thundered is now filled with cities built by the descendants of the weakest human species that somehow learned to kill smarter than everything else could survive. The question that should keep you awake tonight isn't whether we made the right choice. It's whether the intelligence that destroyed a world of wonders is sufficient to maintain the simplified world we created in its place.